She built an empire worth $3 billion. He builds things with his hands for 300 a day. When a burst pipe forced him into her fortress at midnight, she gave him a rule book. He gave her something she had not felt in years, the terrifying sensation of being seen. But what happens when the most powerful woman in the city must choose between the throne she bled for and the man who made her remember she was human? This is a story about control, sacrifice, and the kind of love that does not ask permission. Drop your city in the comments. Let us begin. The 43rd floor of the Ardent Tower did not feel like a home. It was never meant to. Victoria Vance had designed every inch of it with the precision of a surgical theater. The walls were the exact shade of white that paint manufacturers called bone ivory, a color she had selected after rejecting 47 samples over 3 weeks. The floors were polished white marble imported from a quarry in Cara, Italy, so smooth that the reflection of the ceiling lights doubled themselves in the stone like ghost images. Every piece of furniture was modern, angular, and deliberately monochrome. No rugs softened the floors, no curtains interrupted the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city like the eyes of something that never blinked. There were no photographs on the walls, no flowers in vases, no bowls of fruit on countertops. There was only order. Vika, as she was known in the 3 floors of Vance Metropolis headquarters that bore her name, had arranged her penthouse the way she arranged her company, with absolute deliberate intention. The mugs in the kitchen cabinet were arranged by descending height. The books on her shelves were organized first by color, then by size, then alphabetically within each color grouping. The television remote was always at a 45-degree angle to the corner of the side table, not because anyone told her it had to be, but because anything else created a low, persistent hum behind her sternum that she had no medical name for but felt as acutely as a splinter. She was 38 years old. She had been running Vance Metropolis, one of the most aggressive urban development corporations on the eastern seaboard, since she was 31. She had survived 3 hostile takeover attempts, 2 recessions, 1 congressional inquiry, and a board of directors that had never once believed she belonged in the chair she occupied. She had survived all of it through a combination of ruthless intellect, ironclad self-discipline, and the quiet, unshakable understanding that the only environment she could trust was one she had built herself. The penthouse was the purest expression of that understanding, which is why on a Tuesday night in early March, when the pipe inside the north wall of her dining room detonated with a sound like a gunshot, the first thing Victoria Vance felt was not alarm. It was grief. The water came fast. It came through the wall in a diagonal spray at first, then in a full pressurized arc as the old copper fitting gave way completely. Within 40 seconds, it had reached the antique wood partition that divided the dining room from the sitting area. The partition was the one piece in the entire apartment that had not been chosen for its aesthetic neutrality. It was a hand-carved mahogany screen imported from a colonial-era estate in Charleston, South Carolina, 200 years old, inlaid with a geometric lattice pattern that had taken an unknown craftsman an estimated 18 months to complete. It had cost Vika $460,000 at auction, and she had not bought it for its beauty, though it was beautiful. She had bought it because it had belonged to her grandmother, and her grandmother was the only person who had ever made her feel like the world was not something to be survived. The water hit the base of the partition at 11:47 p.m. Vika was already standing in the dining room in her robe, her hand pressed flat against her sternum, watching the damage expand in real time. She had turned the main water valve off from the utility closet in a matter of seconds, her movements swift and automatic, but not before the base of the partition had absorbed a full 90 seconds of direct water contact. The wood was already darkening at the grain, already swelling. "No," she said, and her voice in the empty apartment was very quiet and very controlled and absolutely nothing like what was happening inside her chest. Her assistant Daniel Park answered on the first ring, despite the hour, which was one of the reasons she paid him what she paid him. "I need a restoration carpenter," she said. "Tonight." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Ms. Vance, it is almost midnight." "I am aware of what time it is, Daniel." "The Alderton firm will not open until 7 a.m. Marchetti Restorations does not have emergency services. I have called Pinnacle, and they have a 6-week backlog. I can get someone on site by Thursday morning at the earliest from any of our approved contractors." Vika looked at the partition. The darkening at the base was moving upward along the grain in slow, deliberate lines like veins filling with something dark. The board of directors meeting was at 9 a.m. the following day. She would not spend it knowing her grandmother's partition was warping itself to pieces on the 43rd floor. "Find me someone tonight," she said. "I do not care where." Another pause. She could hear Daniel's keyboard. She could also hear the particular quality of his silence that meant he had found something he was not sure she would accept. "There is a contractor available," he said carefully. "He is not on our approved list. He does residential and commercial restoration work. His reviews are strong, excellent, actually specifically for antique woodwork. He has a small independent operation. His name is Elias Thorne. Send him the address." "Ms. Vance, I should mention." He called back to confirm the job, and he mentioned that his childcare arrangement for the evening has fallen through and he would need to bring his daughter. She is 7 years old. He said it would only be for tonight and she would not be any trouble. The pause this time came from Vika's end. "A child," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the partition again. The waterline was now 4 inches up from the base. She thought of her grandmother's hands, papery and warm, tracing the inlaid geometric pattern, and telling a 6-year-old Vika that beautiful things were worth protecting. "Tell him the hourly rate is double our standard," she said. "Tell him to get here in 30 minutes, and tell him the child is not to touch anything." Elias Thorne arrived in 26 minutes, which Vika noted. She heard them before she saw them. There were footsteps in the corridor outside, 2 sets, one adult and deliberate one, small and slightly shuffling, and then the particular sound of a child's voice asking a question in a stage whisper that was not particularly quiet. "Is it a hotel?" "It is someone's house," said a man's voice, low and even. "It looks like a hotel." "Lots of things look like one thing and are another thing." "Like what?" "Like you. You look like you are asleep right now, but you are clearly not." A small giggle immediately suppressed. Vika opened the door before they could knock. Elias Thorne was taller than she expected. He was somewhere in his mid-30s with the kind of build that came from actual physical labor rather than a gym membership, broad through the shoulders and chest, with forearms that were visible below his rolled sleeves even in the ambient light of the corridor. He was wearing clean dark jeans and a gray work shirt, and he was carrying a large steel tool case in one hand and a folded canvas drop cloth under his other arm. His face was angular and weathered in a way that suggested he spent a lot of time outdoors. His eyes, when they met hers, were a steady, unremarkable brown that somehow had the quality of paying close attention. Beside him, holding a small backpack shaped like a turtle, was his daughter. Lily Thorne had her father's dark hair cut bluntly at her chin and enormous eyes that were currently fixed on Vika with the specific, unguarded intensity of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned to pretend she was not staring. She was wearing striped pajama pants and a slightly too large sweatshirt that said Brooklyn Nets on the front in faded letters. "Ms. Vance," Elias said. He did not extend a hand. He gave a single professional nod. "Elias Thorne. Your assistant said it was an emergency situation with an antique wood piece." "Correct," Vika said. "Please come in." Her eyes moved to the girl. Lily stepped through the doorway and looked up at the ceiling, then at the floors, then turned in a slow, deliberate circle, taking in the entire entryway. "It looks like a museum," she said. "Lily," her father said. It was a single quiet word, but it carried a specific practiced weight. "It is fine," Vika said, and she was not entirely sure why she said it. "The partition is this way." She led them through the entryway and into the dining room. Elias set down his tool case without being told to, crouched immediately at the base of the partition, and began examining the wood with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who was temporarily unaware that anyone else was in the room. He pressed 2 fingers along the grain at the waterline. He leaned close and tilted his head slightly, examining the inlay seams. He ran his thumb very gently along the base edge, feeling the degree of expansion. Vika stood 3 feet back and watched his hands. They were remarkable hands. There was no other honest word for it. They were large and deeply calloused at the palm, with knuckles that bore the faint accumulated scars of a decade of physical work, and they moved over the surface of the wood with a delicacy that seemed incongruous with their size. She noticed with the involuntary precision of someone trained to observe everything that his ring finger was noticeably longer than his index finger, a detail that was both biologically unremarkable and for reasons she could not immediately categorize completely arresting. "How long was it in direct contact with the water?" he asked without turning around. "Approximately 90 seconds of direct spray, less than 2 minutes total immersion at the base." "Good, that is manageable. The inlay is intact. I can see 2 sections where the moisture has lifted the grain, but the structural integrity of the frame is still sound." He stood and turned to face her. "I can stabilize it tonight so no further damage occurs. Full restoration is a longer process. The wood needs to be dried properly before any refinishing, and the inlay joints need to be reseated with the right adhesive, not just any wood glue." "How long for the full restoration?" He considered this honestly, not in the way people estimated when they wanted to seem thorough, but in the way people estimated when they actually understood the scope of what they were looking at. 2 to 3 weeks, depending on how the wood responds to the drying process. Vika processed this. 3 weeks meant 3 weeks of this man and his daughter in her apartment. "I have a board of directors meeting at 9 a.m., she said. "I will have it stable before 7, he said simply, as if this were not a significant promise to make at 5 minutes to midnight. She looked at him for a moment. 3 weeks, she said. "There are conditions." "I assumed there would be." She walked to the kitchen counter and picked up the single sheet of paper she had printed in the 12 minutes between Daniel's call and Elias's arrival. She extended it to him. He took it, read it. His expression did not change, but she watched his eyes move through each line with the same careful attention he had given the wood. The conditions were specific. No tools left out on any surface overnight. All work to be contained to the dining room and sitting area. The child was to remain in the corner of the dining room designated with a strip of blue painter's tape Vika had already placed on the floor while she was waiting. No unnecessary conversation during working hours, which she had defined as 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. No food or beverages anywhere except the kitchen, which was off limits. She would provide access to the service bathroom only. Elias finished reading. He folded the paper in half along its existing crease, a habit she thought, or possibly a small, deliberate act of containment. "The painter's tape boundary for my daughter," he said. "Yes. She is 7. I am aware." He held her gaze for a moment. She had had this look directed at her before by people who thought they were the first ones to find her cold. They were not. "I understand the conditions," he said. She nodded once. "I will leave you to it." She turned to walk back to her bedroom, and behind her she heard Lily's stage whisper again, directed at her father. "Dad, there are no pictures of people anywhere in this house." "Get your coloring book out, Bug," her father said quietly. "She does not have any people in her pictures either, like on the walls, only shapes." "Lily, I am just saying." Vika stopped walking for 1 full second, though she did not turn around. Then she continued down the hallway to her bedroom and closed the door with a precise and measured click. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and listened to the quiet professional sounds of a man beginning to work the low scrape of the tool case being opened, the soft click of a flashlight, the measured, deliberate movements of someone who knew what they were doing and was not in a hurry to prove it. And underneath those sounds barely audible, the small shuffling sound of a 7-year-old settling cross-legged on a floor that probably cost more per square foot than some people's monthly rent, opening a coloring book and beginning to hum something tuneless and quiet to herself. Vika lay back on top of her bed, still in her robe, and stared at the ceiling. The apartment did not feel entirely like itself tonight. She was not sure yet what to call the feeling that accompanied that observation. She lay still, listening to the sounds of the man and his daughter working and humming in her dining room, watching the pale geometry of city light move across her ceiling, and she did not sleep for a very long time. At 6:43 a.m., Elias knocked once on her bedroom door. "The partition is stable," he said through the door. "I have documented the condition of each section with photographs. I will send them to you. I will be back at 7 tomorrow morning to begin the drying process." A pause. "We are leaving now. Lily wanted me to tell you that she did not touch anything, Her words were, "I want her to know I was very careful. I do not know if that is relevant to you. Good luck with your meeting." Footsteps. The quiet weighted sound of a front door closing with care. Vika sat up in bed. The light in the room was the pale gray of early morning. In the dining room through the half-open door, she could see that the floor around the partition had been dried completely, the drop cloth removed, and every tool put away. The only evidence that anyone had been there at all was the faint, pleasant smell of the specific wood conditioner. He had used something warm and organic that moved through the sterile, recycled air of the apartment like something from an entirely different world. She sat with that smell for a moment. Then she stood, straightened her robe, and began preparing for her board meeting with the same systematic efficiency she brought to every morning. But she left the bedroom door exactly as it was half open for reasons she did not examine. The board meeting lasted 4 hours and 12 minutes, and Vika spent exactly none of it thinking about the man she had left working in her dining room. That was what she told herself on the elevator ride back up to the 43rd floor at 2:17 that afternoon. Her heels precise against the mirrored elevator floor, her portfolio tucked under her arm. Her face arranged in the neutral, composed expression she had been wearing for so many years that she sometimes forgot it was an expression at all, and not simply her face. The meeting had gone the way board meetings always went when she was the only woman in the room. There had been the customary 45 minutes of pre-meeting conversation that excluded her by design, the kind of exclusion that was never explicit enough to confront. There had been Raymond Holt, the board's longest-serving member, speaking slightly past her right shoulder whenever she was presenting a habit she had cataloged and chosen not to address, because addressing it would cost more political capital than ignoring it. There had been the proposal for the Oakwood District development, which she had moved through the agenda with surgical efficiency, keeping her own feelings about it in a compartment she had built specifically for feelings that were not yet useful. She had been running Vance Metropolis for 7 years. She had learned early that the board did not want a CEO. They wanted a symbol that performed competence without unsettling the existing architecture of power. She had spent 7 years performing competence, while simultaneously quietly, irreversibly building something they did not understand and could not dismantle. She was good at it. She was perhaps the best in the city at it. But in the elevator going up to the 43rd floor, with the slight hum of the cables above her, and the city spread 43 stories below her feet, she thought briefly and involuntarily about the smell of wood conditioner moving through her apartment at 6 in the morning like a signal from somewhere else. She stepped out of the elevator and heard, before she had even reached her door, the sound of a radio. It was not loud. It was in fact playing at what most people would consider a perfectly reasonable volume, which was precisely the problem. The problem was not the volume. The problem was that Vika's apartment did not have a radio and had therefore never had the sound of one. And the sound that was coming through her front door was warm and slightly crackling. The kind of signal that came from a physical radio with an antenna, playing what sounded like a jazz station, and under it, threading through, it was the sound of Lily Thorne singing along to a song she clearly only half knew, filling in the words she did not know with syllables that were phonetically adjacent but entirely invented. Vika opened the door. The scene in her dining room had rearranged itself in her absence in ways she was not prepared for. Elias had set up a controlled drying station around the base of the partition with 2 low-heat professional dryers positioned at precise angles and a series of moisture-reading instruments clipped at intervals along the wood. The equipment was orderly and purposeful. That part she could have anticipated. What she had not anticipated was Lily, who had migrated from the painter's tape square Vika had designated yesterday, and was now sitting cross-legged on the white marble floor approximately 4 feet outside her boundary, surrounded by a loose constellation of colored pencils with a large drawing pad open on her knees. She was drawing what appeared from the doorway to be an extremely detailed dragon. On the kitchen counter there was a small battery-powered radio the size of a paperback book playing jazz. On the stove there was a pot. Vika stood in the doorway of her own apartment and felt the specific full-body sensation of her environment having been altered without her authorization. Elias was at the partition working with a fine-tipped instrument along one of the inlay seams, and he looked up when she entered. He read her expression with no apparent alarm. "Afternoon," he said. "There's cooking happening on my stove," Vika said. "Chicken soup," he confirmed. Lily had a scratchy throat this morning. It will be done in about 40 minutes. We will clean up after. Vika set her portfolio on the entryway table and walked into the kitchen. The pot was one she recognized as from her own cabinet, the large Le Creuset she had owned for 4 years and used twice. It was currently full of something that smelled aggressively of garlic and thyme and homemade stock, and it had produced a thin film of steam that, had she noted, slightly affected the humidity reading on the kitchen air monitor. She looked at the pot. She looked at the air monitor. She looked at the child sitting outside the designated square. She walked back into the dining room. I designated a specific area for your daughter. Elias did not look up from the inlay seam. She moved. I can see that she moved. Lily, he said without raising his voice. Lily looked up from her dragon. She assessed the situation with the frank clarity of someone who did not yet fully understand consequences, but had a working instinct for adult tension. I was getting a cramp, she said. Back to your spot, please. Lily considered this. She gathered her colored pencils with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who was complying but wanted it on record that she had opinions about the matter, and relocated herself back inside the painter's tape boundary. She resumed drawing without further comment. Vika turned to look at the pot again from the dining room doorway. The smell of it was moving through the apartment with complete disregard for the air filtration system she paid a significant monthly fee to maintain. It was not an unpleasant smell. That was almost the more irritating part. It was the smell of something being made with care, something domestic and warm and entirely incongruous with the bone ivory walls and the imported marble floors and the absence of photographs. That evening she acted. She found a check in her desk drawer from the personal account, not the corporate one. She wrote a number on it that represented approximately 2 weeks of what a mid-level Vance Metropolis employee made in a month. She left it on the kitchen counter with a note that read, "Food expenses. Please eat elsewhere during working hours." She went to bed. In the morning, she found the check on the kitchen counter, torn in half, precisely in half along a clean straight line, as if he had used a ruler. Vika stood in her kitchen in her robe, looking at the two halves of the check, and felt something she did not immediately have a word for. It was not quite anger. Anger she knew well. Anger was a tool she kept sharpened and in a specific place. This was something different, something that moved slightly faster than anger and landed somewhere lower in her chest. She left the two halves where they were and went to find him. He was already at the partition, starting early with a cup of coffee from a travel thermos beside him on the drop cloth. Lily was not there yet. He had come alone this morning, which meant he had managed childcare, which meant the torn check was a decision made with full awareness of its cost. "I left you a check," she said. He did not turn from the partition. "I saw it." "You tore it." "I did." It was a reasonable accommodation for the disruption the cooking causes to my air system. He set down the tool he was holding, a fine chisel she did not know the name of, and turned to face her. He was not angry. That was the first thing she noticed. His expression was even and direct and carried no particular heat, which was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. "Ms. Vance," he said, "I appreciate the gesture of the doubled rate. That is fair compensation for the work. But that check was not about the air system. It addressed a legitimate issue with the air filtration. It addressed the fact that the smell of my cooking bothers you," he said. "Which is your right. It is your home. But the way to address that is to say it directly. Writing me a check is a way of turning a personal preference into a transaction. I do not take money for being inconvenient. I take money for my craft." Vika looked at him. In 7 years of running a billion-dollar company, she had developed a comprehensive internal library of the ways people pushed back on her, the strategies and postures and carefully worded resistances. None of them had ever sounded quite like this. Quiet without aggression, and with the specific unnerving quality of something that did not need her agreement in order to be true. "You tore a significant amount of money in half," she said. "Yes. Because of a principle. Because I sell my craftsmanship," he said simply. "Not my right to be a father." He picked up the chisel again and turned back to the partition. "The inlay work on the third panel is more complex than it looked initially. There was a previous repair done maybe 30 years ago, not done well. I will need to remove it and redo it properly. I wanted you to know." She stood in the doorway for a moment longer in her robe in the early morning in an apartment that smelled faintly of last night's chicken soup. Then she turned and went to make coffee, and she did not say anything else about the check. The days developed their own rhythm, which was the thing she had not accounted for and which she found most destabilizing. Elias arrived each morning between 7 and 7:15. He set up his equipment with an efficiency that she found herself observing from the kitchen while she went through her morning emails. He worked with a focus that was not performative. He did not look around for acknowledgement. He did not try to fill silence with conversation. He simply worked with his radio at its low crackling volume, and the apartment absorbed the sound of it. The way still water absorbs a stone slowly, completely changing its surface without apparent resistance. Lily came with him on the days when school ended early, and on those days, the dynamic in the apartment shifted in a way that Vika had no framework for. The child had an inner world of remarkable density. She narrated it in fragments mostly to her father, sometimes apparently to the partition itself. She asked questions that had the quality of being genuinely unanswered in her mind, rather than asked for conversational purposes. She wanted to know how wood knew which direction to grow. She wanted to know if the people who made the partition were still alive. She wanted to know if a building could be lonely. On the fourth day, Vika came home from the office to find a crayon smudge on the glass surface of the dining room side table. It was small, cerulean blue, waxy, perhaps 2 inches in diameter. It was on the corner of the table nearest the painter's tape square, which meant Lily had either leaned over the boundary or the boundary had migrated slightly, either possibility carrying its own implications. Vika set down her bag and walked to the table and looked at the smudge for a long moment. "Lily." Her voice came out clipped and cold in a way that she had not intended but also had not prevented. Lily looked up from her drawing pad. "Did you put this on my table?" The child looked at the smudge. A complicated series of expressions moved across her face in rapid succession, ending in the specific resigned expression of a 7-year-old who knows exactly what happened and is doing the moral calculation of honesty in real time. "It was an accident," she said. "I was reaching for my purple and my hand slipped." "These tables are not toys," Vika said. "They are not surfaces for your crayons. I established very clearly what the boundaries were." Lily's chin dropped slightly. Not fully, not the way a child drops their chin when they are performing contrition, but the way a child drops their chin when something has hit them in a place they were not guarding. "I am sorry," she said quietly, and with the particular flatness of genuine feeling. Sorry does not restore a glass surface. There was a shift in the room. It was not a sound. It was the quality of the air, the way certain silences have weight and direction. Vika became aware of it half a second before she became aware of Elias, who had set down his tools and turned and was now looking at her from across the room. He did not raise his voice. He had not raised his voice once in 4 days, and he did not raise it now. But his expression had changed, and the change was profound enough that Vika found herself going still. "She apologized," he said. "The table is glass. I will clean it." He held her gaze steadily. "Lily, go wash your hands, please." He waited until his daughter had padded obediently down the hall to the service bathroom. Then he looked back at Vika, and his voice, when it came, was measured and quiet and absolutely direct. "She is 7 years old," he said. "She has been in your home for 4 days, and she has stayed inside your lines, and she has not touched your things, and she has said please and thank you, and she has tried, genuinely tried, because I asked her to, and because she is a good kid. A crayon smudge on a glass table is not damage. It is a 7-year-old existing in a space." Vika said nothing. She was not accustomed to being corrected. "I will clean it," he said again. "It will take 30 seconds and leave no mark." He paused. "But I need you to understand something, Ms. Vance. I accepted your conditions because the work matters and the rate is fair. But my daughter is not a condition I accepted. She is a person." He picked up a clean cloth from his supply kit, walked to the table, and removed the crayon smudge in exactly the time he had promised. It left no mark. Then he looked around the apartment slowly with an expression Vika had not seen directed at her before. It was not contempt. It was something quieter and somehow more difficult to absorb. When his eyes came back to hers, she saw in them something that looked with an accuracy that made her want to step back like pity. "This is a very expensive property, Ms. Vance," he said, "but it is a prison, not a home." He said it the way people state things they have observed clearly and feel no need to argue about. He said it, and then he turned back to his work, and his radio played something low and instrumental, and from down the hall came the sound of water running as Lily washed her hands. Vika stood in the center of her dining room in the specific, unmoving stillness of someone who has just taken a blow they did not see coming in a fight they did not know they were in. The glass table caught the afternoon light from the window and threw it in small bright pieces across the marble floor. She walked to her bedroom and closed the door, and she stood with her back against it for a long time, breathing carefully. And she thought about prisons, and she thought about what they were built to keep out and what they ended up keeping in. And she did not come to any conclusions, but the question stayed with her for the rest of the evening in a way she could not arrange into order, no matter how she tried. That night, she ate dinner alone at the kitchen counter, something she did every night, but which tonight felt for the first time in a long time, like a choice she was aware of making rather than simply a fact of her life. Through the wall, she could hear Elias packing up his tools. She could hear Lily asking him something. His low answer, Lily's response, and then the particular sound of his radio being clicked off, which always marked the end of the day with the finality of a period at the end of a sentence. She heard the front door close. She looked at the glass table from across the room, clean, unmarked, catching the light. She looked at it for a long time. Then she got up and put her dinner plate in the dishwasher and turned off the kitchen lights. And she walked to her bedroom, and she did not adjust the remote control to its 45-degree angle when she passed the side table, and she did not fully understand why, except that something in her, something small and unarmored and located somewhere very close to the center of her chest, was very quietly and against all her better judgment, beginning just barely to move. She did not move the remote control back. That was the first thing she noticed the following morning when she walked through the living room at 6:45 with her coffee and saw the side table with the remote sitting at an angle that was not 45 degrees and was not anything she had specified and was by every measure her nervous system had been trained to apply wrong. She stopped. She looked at it. She waited for the low, persistent hum behind her sternum that had always accompanied disorder in her environment. The hum that had been with her so long she had stopped thinking of it as a symptom and started thinking of it as simply the sound her interior made. It was quieter this morning. Not gone, but quieter, as if something had been adjusted in a room she could not directly access. She left the remote where it was and went to review her morning briefings. Elias arrived at 7:03. He had Lily with him. It was a Wednesday, and school ended at noon on Wednesdays, and Lily arrived carrying the turtle backpack and a new library book about deep-sea creatures that she held against her chest with both arms, the way children hold things they are currently the most interested in. She went directly to her square without being told. Vika, standing at the kitchen counter with her second coffee, registered this and said nothing. The work on the partition had entered its second phase. The drying process had been completed to Elias's satisfaction, and he had begun the careful work of reseating the inlay joints, which required a level of precision that kept him working in near total stillness for long stretches, with only the small, deliberate movements of his hands and the occasional low sound of him exhaling slowly when a joint seated correctly. Vika had begun working from home 2 days ago. She told herself this was because of an upcoming merger negotiation that required sustained concentration, and that was also true, but it meant she was present in the apartment during his working hours, in a way she had not been in the first week, and the apartment in those hours was a different place than it was when she was alone in it. It had a temperature it did not otherwise have. On Thursday of the second week, the weather broke cold and hard, and Vika came home from a site meeting at 2 p.m, feeling the beginnings of something that she told herself was allergies because she did not get sick. She had not been sick in 4 years. Sickness was a form of loss of control that her schedule simply did not accommodate, and her schedule had always previously been the most persuasive argument available. By 6 that evening, her body had clearly not received the briefing. She was in her bedroom when it began. a sudden disorienting wave of heat that reversed itself into cold before she could adjust to it, and then the particular humiliating lurch of her stomach that left no room for negotiation. She made it to the bathroom in time, but only barely, and what followed was the specific indignity of being ill in a way that was loud and involuntary, and that she could hear with a detached and mortified clarity was almost certainly audible through the bathroom door, and possibly through the bedroom door beyond it. She knelt on the bathroom floor, which was cold marble, and which she was grateful for, and pressed her cheek against the side of the cabinet, and she waited for the wave to pass the way she waited for everything she could not prevent, by holding herself very still and letting it move through her and not asking anyone for anything. The wave passed. She became aware that she was cold and that her forehead was wet, and that she was going to need to get herself to the bed and find the fever medication that was in the kitchen cabinet, and that these two objectives were at this moment somewhat incompatible given the distance between them and the current reliability of her legs. She opened the bathroom door and found the bedroom dim and empty, which was what she had expected. What she had not expected was to look through the half-open bedroom door and find Elias in the hallway, not inside the room, standing at the threshold, with the specific considered distance of someone who had heard something and made a deliberate decision about how close to get. He looked at her. He took in the whole picture without apparent discomfort, and without the particular expression she had been dreading, the soft, pitying, reaching expression that people made when they thought you needed to be gathered in, when they thought proximity was the same thing as help. His expression was simply practical. "Fever," he said. "I am fine," she said, because this was what she said always to everything as a reflex, older than any conscious decision. He did not argue with this. He also did not move away. "Fever medication," she said after a moment, because the room had tilted slightly, and arguing required more resources than she currently had. "Kitchen, upper cabinet left of the refrigerator." He nodded once and left. She heard him in the kitchen, heard the cabinet open, heard the particular sound of him filling a glass with water. She made it to the bed on her own and sat on the edge of it because lying down felt like concession, and she was not yet ready for concession. He came back. He set the glass of water and the fever pill on the nightstand with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, not handing them to her, not hovering, simply placing them at a distance she could reach without assistance. He looked at the thermostat on the bedroom wall, then at her, making a brief and accurate assessment. "You are freezing," he said. "I am fine." He walked to the thermostat and adjusted it without asking her permission, raising it 3 degrees. Then he pulled the folded blanket from the foot of her bed and set it near her on the mattress within reach, without draping it over her, without touching her at all. Then he walked to the bedroom door and stood in the frame of it, his back to the room facing the hallway. "Lily is in the dining room," he said. "She has her book. I'm going to clean the bathroom floor, and then I'm going to finish the section I was working on, and then we will get out of your way. You do not have to talk to us." He left. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the water running in the bathroom, the efficient impersonal sound of someone cleaning a mess without commentary. She listened to the soft sounds of Lily turning pages in the dining room. She listened to the thermostat clicking as the room warmed. She took the fever pill. She drank the water. She lay down. There was something in his departure from the room, in the specific way he had positioned himself in the doorway with his back to her, in the way he had placed every object within reach, but had not tried to put anything into her hands, that undid something in her chest that she had not known was still being held together. He had not tried to hold her. He had not tried to comfort her with his physical presence. He had not made her illness into an occasion for closeness that she had not asked for and would not have been able to accept. He had simply looked at what was needed and provided it, and then made himself scarce in the specific way that communicated without words that her privacy was not an obstacle he was trying to work around, but a condition of hers that he intended to respect. She had not been cared for like that since her grandmother, without the caring being about the person doing it. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried as a rule, but something behind her eyes went very hot for a long moment, and she pressed them shut and breathed steadily until it passed. And when it passed, she felt lighter in a way that was slightly frightening, because she did not know what had been released or where it had gone. She slept. She woke at some point in the deep part of the evening, after 9, to the apartment in quiet darkness. The fever had broken. The glass on the nightstand was empty. She had no memory of finishing it. The blanket was over her, and she had no memory of pulling it over herself either, and for a moment she lay still with that fact, not examining it, simply registering it the way you register something you know has meaning but are not ready to assign yet. She got up carefully, wrapped herself in the blanket, and walked down the hallway into the living room. The apartment was empty. Elias and Lily had gone. The dining room was in its end-of-day order tools, packed equipment squared. The bathroom was clean. The kitchen was, as she walked through it, also clean, and on the counter, covered with a plate to keep it warm, was a bowl of leftover soup from the batch Lily had needed earlier in the week, with a folded paper towel beside it that had one line written on it in a hand she did not know yet but recognized immediately as his angular and spare and without flourish. "Eat something," it said. Nothing else. Vika stood in her kitchen in the dark in a blanket with a bowl of someone else's soup and read those 2 words 4 times. Then she sat down and ate every bit of it. The next morning, she did not address any of it. This was a decision she made with clear eyes. She did not have a vocabulary for what had happened that was not either clinical or sentimental, and she distrusted both. Elias arrived at 7:08 and went directly to the partition, and she went directly to her home office, and the day arranged itself around its own logic, which was what days did when you were disciplined enough to let them. But at noon she came out of her office to find Elias in the living room. He had not intended her to see him. She understood that immediately. He was sitting on the floor near the bookshelves, which she had not given him any reason to be near, with his back against the shelves, and one knee drawn up, and in his hands was one of her books. It was not a light book. It was a graduate-level text on structural engineering principles, specifically the theory of load-bearing core systems in high-rise construction, 540 pages with marginal notes in her own handwriting from a graduate seminar she had audited 11 years ago. She had not looked at it in 2 years. She had not imagined anyone else looking at it ever. He was on page 216. He looked up when she stopped in the doorway. He did not startle, but there was a brief contained moment of a person recalibrating, deciding how to hold the situation. He looked at the book, then at her with an expression that was neither apologetic nor defiant, but somewhere more honest than either. "I hope that is all right," he said. "I was on a break. It was in reach." She looked at the book. She looked at the page he was on. Page 216 was in the middle of a chapter on eccentric load distribution in asymmetric tower geometries, which was one of the more technically demanding sections in the text, and was not by any measure casual reading. "That is a graduate engineering text," she said. "I know," he said. "I have read the first half of it before, a different copy at the city library. They only had one copy, and it had a 2-week limit." She was quiet for a moment. "You have been reading structural engineering theory at the library." "And other things." He was not defensive about it not performing humility and not performing confidence. He simply stated it the way he stated most things, as information. "I did 2 years of an architecture program at State before I had to leave. My father died. There was the family business, and then there was Lily." He set the book down on his knee, keeping his place with his thumb. "The library has most of what I need. The internet has the rest." Vika walked into the living room and sat down in the armchair across from him, which was not something she had planned to do, and which she was aware of doing with the specific awareness of someone stepping off a curb they had been standing on for a long time. "What made you leave the library copy before you finished it?" she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a full smile, something smaller. "The chapter on cantilever stress distribution in composite materials. I was 2 pages from the end when my time was up, and the next hold was already in. It was a bad 2 weeks." "That is the best chapter in the book," she said, and she said it without thinking, and then she heard herself say it, and it was too late to take it back, and she discovered she did not want to. He looked at her with that steady, attentive expression. "It is. The part about the relationship between material memory and structural failure is something I have been thinking about ever since. Material memory is not a universally accepted framework in the field," she said. "There is a legitimate debate about whether materials retain stress patterns in a way that affects long-term behavior, or whether we are projecting continuity onto what is essentially probabilistic failure. I know, he said, but the practical evidence from restoration work supports the memory model. I see it in wood specifically. Old wood that has held weight for a long time behaves differently under new stress than new wood. It resists in a particular direction. It remembers what it was built to do. She looked at him. She had had conversations like this, conversations that moved at this speed and with this kind of mutual traction with perhaps 4 people in her adult life. 2 of them were academics she had met at a conference. One was a structural engineer she had hired and eventually had to let go because he was better at theory than execution. One was her grandmother, who had no formal education past high school and who understood how things worked at a level that had nothing to do with credentialing. She had not had this conversation with a man sitting on her living room floor in work clothes with sawdust on his forearms. "The book is yours to finish," she said. "Leave it here when you are done with the project." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "I will return it," he said. "I said leave it." A pause. "Thank you," he said, and the way he said it was simple and without performance, and that simplicity landed somewhere in her chest with a weight that she did not try to measure. She stood up and went back to her office, but she left the door open. That evening, she walked into the supply room off the kitchen where she kept excess stationery and paper goods and retrieved the large format drawing pad she had purchased 2 years ago for an architectural presentation she had ultimately executed digitally. It was still in its packaging. She carried it out and set it on the side table nearest the painter's tape square in the dining room, along with a set of Prismacolor pencils she had used once for color coding a project timeline and never touched again. She did not say anything about it to anyone. She went back to her office. In the morning, the drawing pad had been moved from the side table and was sitting inside the painter's tape square, and Lily was already using it bent over it with focused intensity, drawing something large and intricate that covered most of the first page. The Prismacolor pencils were arranged in a careful row beside her, in order of color, lightest to darkest, which was not something Vika had specified, but which she recognized immediately as a system, a child's instinctive effort at order in an environment where order was clearly valued. Elias looked at Vika from across the room when she came in. He read what she had done in the same way he read the partition carefully and without rushing to a conclusion. She met his look briefly and then went to make coffee. It was the most they had said to each other without using any words at all. That afternoon, Lily looked up from her drawing pad and held it out toward Vika, who was walking through the dining room with a stack of documents. "I drew a picture of your house," Lily said. Vika stopped. She looked at the drawing. It covered the full page in rich layered color, and it was objectively remarkable for a 7-year-old. Lily had drawn the apartment from a bird's-eye perspective, the geometric precision of the furniture, the long white rectangles of the windows, the dark mahogany shape of the partition in the dining room. But she had also added things that were not in the apartment. In the corner of the drawing near the window, there was a plant with large round leaves. On the kitchen counter, there was a bowl of something orange fruit, possibly flowers. It was unclear but alive-looking. And in the living room, seated in the armchair near the bookshelves, there was a small figure, angular and geometric, with dark hair reading. "That is you," Lily explained helpfully, pointing at the figure. "I put you there because you are always reading or working, and I thought if you were in the picture, the house would look less empty." Vika stood holding her documents and looking at the drawing for a moment that lasted slightly longer than she had intended. "It is very good," she said. "You can have it," Lily said. "If you want, you do not have any pictures of people." Vika looked at the drawing. Then she looked at Lily, who was watching her with those enormous eyes, and who was not offering this because she wanted anything in return, or because she had been coached to offer it. She was offering it because she was 7 years old, and she had decided that Vika should have a picture with a person in it, and that was the full extent of the calculation. "I would like that," Vika said. And she meant it. That night, after Elias and Lily had gone, Vika stood in the dining room with the drawing in her hand and looked at the partition, which was now 3/4 restored, the inlay reseated, and the grain refinished across the lower 2 panels, the wood glowing in the lamplight with a warmth that it had not had when she bought it, because it had been behind glass at the auction house, and glass is not the same as lamplight. She thought about material memory. She thought about old wood that remembered what it was built to do. She thought about a 7-year-old who had looked at an apartment designed to keep everything out and had drawn a person into it and called it less empty. She walked to the bookshelf in the living room and propped Lily's drawing against the books where the structural engineering text no longer was, because Elias had taken it to the dining room to read at the end of the day. The drawing sat there among the monochrome spines, vivid and full of color, a plant that did not exist, and a bowl of something orange and alive, and a small dark-haired figure reading in an armchair inhabiting a space that had been for a very long time designed to be inhabited by no one at all. Vika stood back and looked at it. The remote control on the side table was still not at 45 degrees. She had stopped noticing. The partition was finished on a Friday. Elias completed the final panel in the late afternoon, working with the same unhurried precision he had brought to every hour of the 3 weeks prior, and when he set down his last tool and stood back to look at the whole piece, Vika came and stood beside him without being asked and without calculating whether standing beside him was something she should do or not do. She simply came and stood there because the partition was finished and it was the most natural thing in the room. It was extraordinary. That was the only honest word for it. The water damage was gone so completely that she could not identify, even looking closely, which panels had been affected. The inlay lattice ran continuous and seamless across the full width of the screen, the geometric pattern flowing from one panel to the next, with the unbroken rhythm of something that had always been whole. The wood glowed a deep living amber in the late afternoon light. It looked, she thought, better than it had when she bought it. It looked the way it must have looked when it was new in a house somewhere in Charleston before time and transport and auction houses had flattened its warmth behind glass and institutional lighting. It looks like itself, she said, and she did not entirely mean the partition. Elias looked at it for another moment. The previous repair they did 30 years ago was holding back the grain on the third panel. He said, removing it let the wood breathe the way it was supposed to. He paused. Your grandmother had good taste. She turned to look at him. She had not told him the partition had belonged to her grandmother. She had not told him anything personal. She did not do that it was one of the foundational rules of the fortress. But she understood, looking at his profile, that he had figured it out the way he figured out everything, by paying close and quiet attention to the evidence available. She did, Vika said. They stood in the amber light for another moment. Lily drew 12 more pages in that drawing pad, he said. She left them for you. They are on the side table. Vika nodded once. She did not look at the side table because looking at it would require managing her face in a way that felt like more effort than she wanted to spend right now. I will have the final invoice to you by Monday, he said. Email it to Daniel. He handles the accounts. A pause. All right. He began to break down his equipment for the last time, folding the drop cloth with the same neat efficiency he had always used, and Vika stood in the amber light of the restored partition and watched him without pretending she was not watching him, because the pretense felt unnecessary in a way that a great many pretenses had begun to feel unnecessary over the past 3 weeks, and she did not know what to do with that except observe it. You could do this at a larger scale, she said. He did not stop packing. I know. There is a market for high-end restoration work at the level you do. Corporate collections, private estates. I know 3 collectors personally who would pay significantly more than residential rates. I'm sure you do, he said. I am not offering you anything, she said quickly. I am making an observation. He looked at her then with that steady brown attention that she had come to understand was not passivity, but something closer to its opposite, a kind of active, thorough seeing that required stillness in the way that very precise tools require stillness. I know you are not, he said, and I appreciate the observation. I have thought about it. The scale would require capital I do not have, and a business infrastructure I do not have time to build right now. He closed the tool case. Lily needs consistency more than I need growth. She has already had enough things change. Vika did not ask about Lily's mother. She did not ask because she had not been told, and she would not ask for something she had not been offered. That was a rule she had kept, a rule that was different from her other rules because it was not about control. It was about respect. The structural engineering text, she said. Did you finish it? The corner of his mouth moved. 2 nights ago. The cantilever chapter was exactly as good as I remembered. There is a follow-up paper by the same author, a journal article 2019 on adaptive composite behavior under cyclic loading. I will email you the link. He looked at her for a moment. You do not have to do that. I know I do not have to, she said. He held her gaze for a second longer than was functionally necessary, and in that second she was aware of the specific charged quality of a moment that could go in more than one direction and that she did not have the capacity to navigate honestly right now, standing in the light of her grandmother's restored partition at the end of 3 weeks that had altered something in her apartment and in herself that she did not yet fully understand. She looked away first. Have a safe evening, she said, and went to her office and sat down at her desk and pulled up a document she did not read for the next 20 minutes. She heard him go. She heard the door close. The apartment settled back into its silence, but it was a different silence than the one she had lived in before he came. It had a different texture now, the way a room has a different texture after someone has been in it, and the warmth of their presence is still present in the air even after the person is gone. She sat with that difference and did not know what to call it. And after 20 minutes, she closed the document and went and looked at Lily's 12 drawings on the side table, and she stood there for a long time, holding them one by one. The following Monday, Daniel knocked on her office door at Vance Metropolis headquarters with an expression she recognized immediately as the expression he wore when delivering information he had already braced himself to deliver. The Oakwood announcement has been moved up, he said. The board wants a press conference before the end of the month. She set down her pen. The environmental impact review is not complete. They are waiving it. Raymond Holt has the votes. He paused. There is something else. The address that Mr. Thorne listed on his contractor agreement. I cross-referenced it this morning when I was processing his invoice. Another pause. It is in Oakwood, Mississippi. Elias Thorne lives in the Oakwood district. She sat very still. The Oakwood development project had been on Vance Metropolis's books for 2 years. It was on paper a mixed-use urban renewal project that would replace a 40-block lower-income residential and commercial district on the city's west side with a planned high-rise development. On paper, it was revenue. On paper, it was the kind of project that looked clean in a prospectus. Off paper, it was the demolition of a neighborhood where approximately 4,000 people lived. She had managed her feelings about Oakwood with the same competence she managed everything she could not afford to act on yet, by putting them in a compartment and labeling the compartment pending and moving on. She had told herself she would find a way to modify the project from the inside. She had told herself she had time, 40 blocks, and Elias Thorne lived in one of them. She went to Oakwood on Thursday evening. She told no one. She drove herself, which she had not done in 3 years, in the black company car that she normally sat in the back of while Daniel drove, and she sat in the front and navigated to the address she had found on his contractor agreement, and she drove through the district alone for the first time. It was not what the Vance Metropolis prospectus described. The prospectus used words like underutilized and economically distressed and redevelopment potential. These were words she had read and approved with the part of her brain she kept strictly zoned for financial architecture. Oakwood, at 7 in the evening, was a neighborhood. It was a neighborhood in the specific, irreplaceable way that only time makes things with the particular density of a community that had been building itself for decades in the same place. The streets were narrow and well used. The storefronts had hand-painted signs and window displays that had been arranged with care. There were people on the front steps of the row houses and on the sidewalks, and they had the ease of people who had been in the same place long enough to trust it. There was a bodega on the corner with a handwritten menu in the window. There was a community center with lights on and a parking lot that was full. She parked across from the community center. She had not intended to stay. She had intended to see the address to understand the geography of what she was dealing with and to leave. But she had been sitting in the parked car for less than 3 minutes when the door of the community center opened and people began to file in, and among them walking beside an older woman with a cane and talking to her with the attentive, full-body focus of someone for whom the conversation was the only thing happening was Elias. He had not seen her. She stayed in the car. She watched through the lit windows of the community center as people arranged themselves on folding chairs, and Elias stood at the front of the room, and she watched him transform in a way that stopped all the thoughts in her head for a full 30 seconds and replaced them with a clarity that was almost physical. He was not a man standing at the front of a room. He was the room. He spoke with a quietness that required people to lean in, and they did. Every one of them. They leaned toward him the way things lean toward whatever holds the most gravity, and he was pointing at something projected on the wall behind him, and she could see from the car that it was a map and a document side by side, and she did not need to hear the words to understand what was happening. He was not asking the neighborhood to feel helpless. He was showing them a structure. He was showing them a way through. She pulled out her phone and turned the brightness down and opened the Vance Metropolis eviction notice template that she knew by heart because she had reviewed the legal language herself 6 months ago. She watched him at the board, and she followed what he was pointing to with her own knowledge of the document, and in the space of 10 minutes she understood with a precision that made her feel cold all over that he had found the same 3 zoning loopholes that her own legal team had missed. He had found them with no law degree and no corporate resources, using what was available to him, the same way he had read graduate engineering theory at a library with a 2-week borrowing limit. He had found them, and he was using them methodically and with a confidence that came from having checked his work. She sat in the car outside the community center for 45 minutes, and she watched the man she had spent 3 weeks trying to categorize as something manageable stand in the lamplight of a neighborhood she was planning to demolish and be simply and irrefutably and without any apparent effort extraordinary. She drove back to the 43rd floor and sat in her white apartment with all the lights off and stared at the restored partition, which held the lamplight in its amber grain, and she thought about what it meant that the same hands that had done that work were now the hands she was required professionally to work against. She did not sleep that night. The call from Raymond Holt came at 8:45 the following morning. "We need to meet," he said, and his voice had the particular quality it carried when the subtext was a threat and the text was a formality. "Today, the full board." The board meeting was not in the scheduled room. It was in the small conference room on the 42nd floor, the one without windows, the one she privately thought of as the room where the board went when they did not want witnesses. Raymond Holt was already seated when she arrived, along with 4 of the 6 other board members, and there was a folder on the table in front of the empty chair that was meant for her. She sat down. She opened the folder. Inside were 3 photographs. The first was of Elias's van parked outside the Ardent Tower, dated 3 weeks ago. The second was of her car parked outside the Oakwood Community Center 2 nights ago, the timestamp visible in the corner. The third was of Elias and Vika, standing together in the dining room of her penthouse, taken from an angle that suggested the source was the building security system, or something very close to it. And they were standing in the amber light of the partition, and they were not touching, and there was nothing in the image that was objectively inappropriate, and yet the image was clearly not accidental, and was clearly not here by accident. She closed the folder. "You have been surveilling me," she said. "We have been protecting the company's interests," Raymond said. He was 64 years old, and he had been on this board since before she was born, and he had never once in 7 years looked at her with anything but the patient, impervious confidence of a man who believed that time was always on his side. "The Oakwood project is the single largest development contract in Vance Metropolis history. Its execution cannot be compromised by a personal entanglement." "There is no personal entanglement," she said. "The optics disagree." He folded his hands on the table. "Here is where we are, Victoria. Sign the demolition order today. Full execution, no modifications, no delays. In return, this folder and everything in it stays in this room." She looked at him. "And if I do not sign today..." Raymond opened the folder again and removed a document she had not seen on her first pass. It was a summary of her psychiatric records, specifically the records from the 18 months following her mother's death when she was 24, when she had been briefly and involuntarily hospitalized, following what the clinical paperwork called an acute stress response, and what she called the worst period of her life. Records that were supposed to be sealed. Records that she had spent 14 years and a significant amount of money ensuring remained private, not because she was ashamed of them, but because she knew with the complete clarity of someone who had operated in this industry for a long time exactly how they would be used. "We release these to 3 financial news outlets," Raymond said. "We frame it as a pattern of instability that calls your fitness for the CEO role into question. The board moves to oust you on grounds of undisclosed health history. It is not pleasant, but it is effective." He paused. "Additionally, we have contacts in the police department. A credible anonymous tip that Mr. Thorne has stolen company equipment planted in his vehicle at an appropriate moment would result in an arrest. Given his custody arrangement, a criminal charge would likely be sufficient to transfer guardianship of his daughter to her maternal grandparents. I understand the situation there is not amicable." The room was absolutely silent. Vika looked at Raymond Holt, and she felt in her chest something that was not fear and was not grief and was not rage, but was all 3 of them happening simultaneously in such close proximity that they had fused into something with no existing name. Lily. The word moved through her with the force of something structural giving way. They were talking about taking Lily. She thought about a 7-year-old with a turtle backpack sitting cross-legged on marble and humming half-remembered songs. She thought about 12 pages of drawings left on a side table. She thought about a child who had looked at a penthouse designed to hold the world at a distance and had drawn a person into it and called it less empty. She thought about Elias standing in the lamplight of that community center, holding a neighborhood together with the same hands that had held her grandmother's wood, together with the same quiet and total competence he brought to everything he did. And she thought about those hands being cuffed about that quiet voice, being silenced about Lily being taken from the only constancy she had. She thought about the look on his face in 3 weeks, patient and attentive, and without any armor because he did not operate behind armor, he had never needed to, and she thought about what it would cost him to be betrayed by someone he had slowly and without announcement begun to trust. She looked at Raymond Holt, and she thought all of this in approximately 4 seconds. Then she arranged her face. She arranged it into something she had worn before, not often, and not lightly because it cost something to wear it, but she knew exactly how it fit. It was the face of a woman who had always known exactly where her priorities were and had simply required a sufficient incentive to stop pretending otherwise. It was the face that made people in this industry say behind closed doors that Victoria Vance was brilliant and dangerous, and ultimately, like all of them, in it for herself. "I will need 1 week," she said, "to prepare the announcement properly." Raymond's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the fractional easing of a man who has expected resistance and received capitulation. 48 hours, he said. 72, she said, because capitulating without negotiating would have looked like something other than selfishness, and she needed him to read it as selfishness. "The announcement will land better if I have time to manage the press framing." He considered this. 72 hours, he agreed. "The demolition order on my desk Friday morning." She nodded once, picked up the folder, and left the room. She sat in the elevator going up to the 44th floor, and she breathed very carefully for the full 90-second ride. And when the doors opened, she walked to her office and closed the door and sat at her desk. And for 2 minutes, she simply sat with her hands flat on the desk surface, feeling the cold of the glass under her palms, grounding herself in the physical world. Then she picked up her phone and called Elias. "I need you to come to the apartment tonight," she said. "There is a final condition issue with the partition. 7 o'clock. A pause. She could hear something in the background of wherever he was, the sound of a radio familiar. "Sure," he said. "Is everything all right with the piece?" "The piece is fine," she said. "I will see you at 7. She hung up and sat alone in her office and looked out through the window at a city she had spent her adult life building things in, and she began methodically and without sentiment to plan the most important demolition of her career. Not the one Raymond Holt had ordered. The other one. She had 72 hours. She picked up her pen and she began. He arrived at 7 exactly. She heard the knock and she stood in the center of her living room for 1 full second before she went to the door. Because she needed that second, she had earned it, and she used it to do the thing she had been doing since she left the board meeting, which was to press every feeling she had into a compartment and turned the lock and put the key somewhere she could not reach it for the next hour. She needed to be someone specific tonight. She needed to be someone Elias would believe because Elias paid close attention and did not miss much, and the performance she was about to give was the most important one of her life. And it had to be perfect because if it was not perfect, he would not run, and if he did not run, they would destroy him. She opened the door. He was wearing the same dark jeans and gray work shirt from the first night, or ones identical to them. And he was alone tonight, no turtle backpack, no small shuffling footsteps beside him, which meant Lily was with someone, and which meant this conversation would not be interrupted. She registered this with the part of her that was still performing a tactical assessment of every variable, the part that had kept her alive in boardrooms for 7 years, and she used it to steady herself. "Come in," she said, and her voice was exactly right. Flat, professional. The voice she used in quarterly reviews when she was preparing to cut a budget. He came in. He looked at her face the way he always looked at things, with that thorough, unhurried attention, and she saw the moment he registered that something was different. His posture shifted barely the way a building shifts. Before anything visible happens, a deep structural adjustment. "What is the condition issue with the partition?" he said. She did not answer immediately. She walked to the dining room and he followed her, and they stood in front of the partition together. The way they had stood in front of it 4 days ago in the amber afternoon light. But tonight the apartment was lit by overhead lights, only white and cold and without warmth, and she had turned them up to full brightness before he arrived, because she needed the room to feel like an office and not like a home. On the dining table behind her there was a document. She had placed it there 20 minutes ago after she had signed it, after she had sat alone with it for a long time first. It was the demolition order for the Oakwood district. She turned and picked it up and held it so he could see her signature at the bottom. Dark and precise. Her full name. Victoria Ann Vance, the signature she used on contracts that moved money. She watched his eyes find it. She watched him read the header. She watched the stillness come over him that was different from his working stillness, deeper, and without the quality of peace. "Vance Metropolis is proceeding with the Oakwood development," she said, and her voice was the voice from the quarterly reviews, clean and without texture. "Full demolition. The order is signed. I wanted you to hear it from me directly as a professional courtesy, given that you are a current resident of the affected district." He looked at the document for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "Professional courtesy, Sam," he said. "The relocation packages are substantial," she said, and she reached behind her and picked up the envelope she had also placed on the table. The envelope she had spent 2 hours on the night before calculating the number with the precision of someone who was trying to do the only thing she could still do from inside the trap she was in. "I have arranged a severance and relocation payment for the work you have done here, plus a supplementary amount given the circumstances. It is enough to relocate your business operations, cover Lily's schooling for several years, and provide a deposit on a permanent residence outside the affected area." She held the envelope out to him. He did not take it. "Vika," he said. It was the first time he had used her name, her real name, the shortened version that almost no one used, and the sound of it in his voice, quiet and direct and carrying the full weight of 3 weeks of paying close attention, went through her chest like something physical. She kept her face exactly where it was. "Take the envelope," she said. "Put it down." "It is a significant amount." "It will." "Put it down," he said again, and his voice was still quiet. But it had a quality now that she had not heard from him before, something that was not anger, but was the thing that lives adjacent to anger in people who do not often feel it. She set the envelope on the table. She kept her eyes on the document in her hand because looking at him directly right now was something she could not afford. "I do not understand," he said. 2 days ago you were going to send me a journal article." "That was a separate matter." "Was it?" "Mr. Thorne." She used his last name with the deliberate distancing precision of someone drawing a boundary in ink. "I run a development company. You are a contractor I hired for a restoration job. The restoration is complete. The development proceeds. These are not related situations." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a person who is listening to something and understanding not just the words but the shape of what is behind them. and she watched him standing in her dining room in the white overhead light, with the partition glowing behind him, and she watched him look at her with those steady brown eyes that had always paid too much attention, and she felt in real time the exact moment he began to see through it. She could not let him see through it. If he saw through it, he would not take the money and he would not leave, and Raymond Holt would make the call and Lily would be taken, and that was the one outcome she had decided in the elevator on the 42nd floor she would burn everything to prevent. She reached for the cruelest tool she had. "You are a talented craftsman," she said, and she put into her voice the specific measured condescension of someone describing a person whose ceiling is visible from where they are standing. The work on the partition was exceptional at its level, but I want to be clear about what this has been. You have been a contractor in my home. I enjoyed our conversations. You are clearly an intelligent man, but intelligence without infrastructure is a hobby, not a career, and this." She gestured at the apartment at the partition at the space between them. "This is not a situation that was ever going to be anything other than what it was. I think you may have constructed a different narrative in your mind. I want to be kind in correcting it." She watched every word land. She watched his face, and she saw the impact move through him, not dramatically, not with visible flinching, but in the way structural damage moves through old wood deep in the grain, in the places that do not show immediately. "The envelope is on the table," she said. "It is considerably more than the invoice amount. I suggest you take it." He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the envelope. Then he looked at the partition, his hands hanging at his sides. And she watched him look at the thing he had made whole again with 3 weeks of careful, irreplaceable work. And she understood in that moment the full and specific cost of what she was doing, and she paid it because it was the only currency she had left that was worth anything. He picked up the envelope. He did not say anything. He walked through the living room and he picked up the work bag he had left by the door, a habit from 3 weeks of daily arrivals, and he opened the front door and he stopped. "Lily left her library book here last week," he said. "The one about the deep-sea creatures. It is on the kitchen counter." His voice was even. It was so even that it was its own kind of devastation. "I will have Daniel return it," she said. He nodded once. He left. The door closed with the same quiet, careful click. It always closed with, because he was a person who closed doors gently, even when everything inside him was not gentle at all. And that detail, that one small involuntary detail of his character, was the thing that finally cracked her open after the sound of it. She stood in the center of her living room alone in the white overhead light, and she pressed both hands flat against her sternum, and she breathed, and she did not allow herself to do anything else for 3 full minutes because she had 58 hours left, and she needed every one of them. She went to her desk, and she got back to work. The next 56 hours were the most concentrated work of her life, and her life had contained a considerable amount of concentrated work. She had begun the preparation before the board meeting in the 2 days following her visit to Oakwood, when she had understood that Raymond Holt would eventually move and had started building what she thought of as a controlled demolition plan. The kind of demolition that looked like a building falling, but was actually a building being taken down with surgical intention piece by piece in exactly the right order. She had 3 objectives: expose the board, void the Oakwood contracts, protect Elias and Lily from the threat Raymond had made with such casual confidence as if people were simply pieces of leverage to be picked up and used and set down. The embezzlement documentation had taken her 3 days to compile. Pulling from financial records she had been quietly preserving for 2 years in encrypted personal storage, the records she had accumulated during a period when she had begun to understand the board's financial behavior well enough to recognize it as criminal, but had not yet decided what to do with that understanding. She had always known on some level that the day would come when she would need them. She had not known what form the day would take. She spent the first night after Elias left on the financial architecture, specifically on the stock position. Shorting her own company's stock was a move that required execution across multiple accounts over a compressed timeline in a way that could not be traced back to her directly until after it was done, and doing it while simultaneously facilitating a hostile acquisition approach for Meridian Group, Vance Metropolis's most ethical competitor, and the only firm in the city she trusted to honor the Oakwood residents once the contracts were voided, required the kind of financial choreography that she could describe to no one and execute with no help. She did it alone in her white apartment at her desk through 2 nights and 1 full day with coffee and the leftover crackers she found in the pantry and Lily's 12 drawings stacked beside her laptop where she could see them. On the second morning, she called her personal attorney and gave him a sealed package of documents with instructions that were specific and irrevocable. On the second afternoon, she called Daniel. "I need you to arrange a press conference for tomorrow at 10 a.m., she said. "The Ardent Tower atrium. Invite every financial and city planning press contact we have." "For the Oakwood announcement," he said. "For an announcement," she said. "Yes." A pause. Daniel had worked for her for 5 years, and he had developed over those years a finely calibrated sensitivity to the specific quality of her pauses. "Ms. Vance," he said carefully, "is there anything I should be prepared for?" "Go home after you book the venue, Daniel," she said. "Take tomorrow afternoon off. Take the rest of the week, actually. I will have your full severance processed by Friday, regardless of how the week concludes, plus 6 months additional as a bonus. You have been excellent." The silence on his end was the silence of a man understanding that a building is about to come down and being moved out of its shadow. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. She hung up and looked at the clock, and looked at Lily's drawings, and looked at the partition across the room glowing in the lamplight that she had switched on because she had turned the overhead lights off sometime in the second night, and had not turned them back on because the overhead lights made the apartment feel like an office, and she did not want to be in an office anymore. She looked at the partition, and she thought about material memory, about old wood that remembered what it was built to do, about things that resist in a particular direction because they remember the weight they were built to hold. She thought about what she had been built to do before the board meetings and the quarterly reviews and the performance of competence for people who had never believed she belonged in the room. She thought about a man who sold his craftsmanship and not his right to be a father. She got up, went to the bathroom, washed her face, changed her clothes, and went to the press conference. The Ardent Tower atrium was full by 10 past 10. She had dressed simply a dark blazer over a white shirt, her hair down, which she almost never wore down in public. Not because she thought it made her look weaker, but because she had always maintained the separation between the CEO and the person, and today that separation no longer applied. She stood at the podium and looked out at the press and at the 3 board members who had come to watch the announcement, including Raymond Holt, who was sitting in the second row with the expression of a man who has already decided the outcome of the day. On the podium in front of her there was a prepared speech about the Oakwood development. She had written it 2 days ago in the board meeting's conference room. It was 4 pages double-spaced, and it used words like urban renewal and community investment and sustainable growth, and it was a very good speech because she was very good at writing things that sounded like one thing and were another thing. She put the speech to one side. She looked at Raymond Holt. She looked at him for long enough that the room noticed the quality of the pause. Then she reached under the podium and removed the stack of manila envelopes she had placed there 30 minutes before the press conference began. "I want to make a different announcement this morning," she said. Her voice in the atrium was clear and even and carried without effort. She had 2 assistants move along the press rows, distributing the envelopes, one to each journalist, while she stood at the podium and watched Raymond Holt's expression move through several stages that she observed with the detached clarity of someone watching weather change from a safe distance. Those envelopes contained documentation of financial misconduct by the majority of the current Vance Metropolis Board of Directors, she said. Specifically, the systematic misappropriation of company capital through a series of shell development contracts over a period of 6 years. The documentation includes internal transfer records correspondence and third-party forensic accounting analysis. Copies have been filed this morning with the SEC, the city's financial crimes unit, and my personal attorney with instructions for public release regardless of any subsequent legal action taken against me. The room had the quality of a room in which everyone has suddenly stopped breathing. Raymond Holt stood up. "Furthermore," she said without looking at him, "I have this morning completed a facilitated acquisition agreement between Vance Metropolis and Meridian Group, effective immediately, transferring operational control to Meridian's board pending regulatory approval. As a condition of the acquisition, all pending demolition contracts for the Oakwood district have been voided. The Oakwood project is terminated. Raymond's voice came from the second row, sharp and controlled, and carrying the specific frequency of a man who has just watched something he built begin to fall. You do not have the authority. I exercised an emergency CEO provision under the company charter, she said, and now she looked at him. Section 14, paragraph 3. I suggest you have your attorney review it. I had mine review it quite carefully last night. She paused. Please sit down, Raymond. He did not sit down, but he did not say anything else either because Raymond Holt was above everything a man who understood when a position was no longer defensible and the position was no longer defensible. She looked back at the room. I am resigning as CEO of Vance Metropolis effective today, she said. I want to be clear that this is not a result of external pressure. It is a choice I am making from a position of complete agency for the first time in a very long time. She looked down at the podium for a moment. That is all. She walked off the podium and out of the atrium through the side door and into the city morning, and she did not look back. The street outside the Ardent Tower was loud and cold and ordinary in the way that streets are ordinary when they are not in a prospectus or a development model, when they are simply places where people live and walk and exist. She stood on the sidewalk in her dark blazer with her hair down, and the city moved around her, and she felt with a clarity she had not felt in years, the specific physical sensation of having no armor on. It was terrifying. It was also undeniably the feeling of air. She had no car. She had arranged for the company car to be returned to Vance Metropolis that morning. She had no office to go back to. She had pending the legal processes that would follow the morning's events. Very limited access to her corporate accounts, and the personal accounts were technically solvent but significantly reduced by the stock position she had executed, which had been personally costly in a way she had calculated and accepted. She had the 43rd floor apartment, which was in her personal name and which was hers regardless of what happened to the company. She had Lily's 12 drawings on the desk. She had the partition glowing in lamplight that she had left on when she left for the press conference, because she had wanted to come home to something warm. She started walking. It took her 40 minutes to walk to Oakwood, which was on something she had planned, but which her feet apparently decided before her mind caught up, and she walked through the morning streets with her hands in her pockets and her hair moving in the cold March air, and she thought about a man who had told her a very expensive property was a prison and not a home. And she thought about what it took to turn one into the other, and whether it was a thing you could build yourself, or whether it required, as most structural projects did, at least 2 sets of hands. She turned onto his street at 11:15. The row houses on his block had the particular lived-in quality she had noticed on her first drive through the district, the window boxes and the hand-painted addresses, and the front steps that had been used for sitting on many times over many years. His house was the third from the corner, blue-gray with white trim. Modest and well-kept, and on the front steps there was a ceramic pot that someone had painted with a geometric pattern, not unlike the lattice inlay on the partition, and she stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a moment, and understood that this was not a coincidence, but a fact about who he was, that he carried his aesthetic into every space he occupied, that beauty for him was not a luxury, but a practice. He was on the front porch of the house next door. The neighbor's house crouched over a porch step that had given way at the left hinge with his tool bag open beside him. He was working without a radio today. She could hear the street, the particular morning sounds of a neighborhood that was still standing, and underneath them the small, precise sounds of a man fixing something that was broken. He looked up when she came to the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at her face. He looked at her simple clothes and her hair down in the absence of the car and the driver and the portfolio and the 43 floors of distance between herself and the rest of the world. He looked at all of it with those steady eyes, and she watched him understand piece by piece the way he understood everything carefully and without rushing. She stood on the sidewalk at the bottom of the porch steps, and she was aware that she was more frightened in this moment than she had been at the podium in the atrium, which had a logic to it, because the atrium had only been her career, and this was something that could not be replaced by a different version of itself. Oakwood is not being demolished, she said. He set down the tool he was holding. The board is being investigated for financial misconduct. Vance Metropolis has been acquired by Meridian Group. The Oakwood contracts are voided. She paused. You should receive formal notification through the district community board within the week. I wanted you to know today." He was looking at her steadily, and she could see him putting it together. All of it, the signed demolition order and the envelope and the things she had said to him in the white overhead light of the apartment, and she watched him arrive at the understanding she had been afraid of and had known was inevitable. "You pushed me out," he said. "Yes." "To protect us." She did not answer that because the answer was yes, and the answer was also that she had not known until she was doing it the full weight of what it would cost, and she did not want to present the cost as something that required his gratitude or his guilt. "I am no longer the CEO of Vance Metropolis," she said instead. "I am currently unemployed, and I have been awake for approximately 50 hours, and I walked here from the Ardent Tower." She stopped. She looked at him. She had prepared nothing beyond this point, because everything beyond this point was not in her control, and she had over the last 3 weeks been slowly learning that not everything needed to be. "You said my house was a prison. Does this neighborhood have room for an unemployed ex-warden?" He stood up from the porch step. He came down the steps slowly, the way he moved through everything with that deliberate, grounded unhurriedness. And he stopped in front of her on the sidewalk, and he looked at her face for a long moment with the full attention of a person who has already made a decision and is simply confirming what he sees. Then he stepped forward, and his arms came around her, not tentatively, not with the hesitant quality of someone testing a boundary, but with the specific, steady certainty of someone who has identified the weight to be supported and is committed to bearing it. And she felt his hands on her back, calloused and warm and real. And the full 56 hours, and the board meeting, and the podium, and the white overhead lights, and the 3 weeks, and the partition, and the check torn in half, all of it moved through her in a single long wave that she did not try to hold back or redirect or contain. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder, and she closed her eyes, and she breathed. From inside the blue-gray house, the front door opened, and there were small, rapid footsteps on the porch above them, and then Lily's voice at full volume abandoning entirely the stage whisper. "Dad, Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you want to stay for—" "Oh." Vika lifted her head. Lily was standing on the porch in her school clothes with the deep-sea creatures library book under her arm, looking down at them with those enormous, unselfconscious eyes. "Hi," said Lily. "Hello," said Vika. Lily looked at her father. She looked at Vika. She performed the rapid, frank assessment of a 7-year-old who has processed the essential facts of a situation and reached a conclusion. "Are you staying?" she said. Vika looked at Elias. He was looking back at her with a quietness that was not an absence but a presence, the way his silences had always been full of something that did not need words to be understood. "I think so," Vika said. "If that is all right." Lily considered this with the gravity it deserved. Then she nodded once with the decisive air of someone who has ratified an important decision. "You can have my chair at lunch," she said. "It is the one by the window. It has the best light for drawing." She turned and went back inside, already moving on to the next thing, because she was 7 years old and the world had just rearranged itself satisfactorily, and there was no reason to stand around about it. Elias made a sound that was low and quiet, and which was, Vika understood the sound of him laughing in the way he did most things without performance, just the genuine unguarded thing itself. She felt it against her shoulder where her forehead was resting, and she thought clearly and without qualification that it was the best sound she had heard in a very long time, possibly the best sound she had ever heard in any building she had ever been inside. The morning was cold and ordinary around them. The street had its sounds. The ceramic pot on the porch step had its geometric pattern. The library book about deep-sea creatures was on its way back inside, tucked under the arm of a child who was already thinking about lunch. Vika stood on the sidewalk in Oakwood with her armor off, and the city moving around her and the warmth of someone's hands on her back, and for the first time in a very long time, she was not managing the environment. She was simply in it. And the difference, she thought, with a clarity that felt like something structural finally settling into its correct position after a very long time of holding wrong, was everything.